and I'll be playing the Bach Italian Concerto. So my folks sent me for piano lessons in my hometown of Pueblo, Colorado. My first teacher had bright orange hair and she smoked cigarettes while I performed. But she's taught me songs with descriptive names like Country Gardens. It's very British, you know. Can't you just see the hollyhocks and the primroses and the delphinium? Or the skater's waltz. Ah, there are these Victorian skaters gliding on the ice in their red velvet coats and white fur muffs. And then, my favorite, the Cossack dance. Playing the piano was just so much fun. When I was 7 years old, I was in the waiting room of my Grandpa Shaw's office. He was a doctor. And actually, this bench, this stool that I'm playing on, actually comes from Grandpa Shaw's office. Isn't that cool? Anyway, we were in Grandpa Shaw's office, not because I was sick, but just because we used to go there all the time to visit. And what do I see on the coffee table between a copy of Popular Mechanics and High Life magazine, but the New Yorker? There was a cartoon on the cover. There was an elegant-looking man in a black top hat and a monocle, smoking a cigarette with a cigarette holder, and a little butterfly was hovering over his head. I was intrigued. I opened it up, and I read, "Goings on about town." And there are pages and pages of listings of performances. The Beatles were performing at Carnegie Hall. There was a musical called Oliver, a comedy called The Odd Couple, and all of these things were taking place in New York City. I mean, what kind of magical place was this New York City? Because I wanted to go to all of these performances, and there was nothing like this going on in my hometown of Pueblo, Colorado. Pueblo, Colorado. On the prairie, halfway between the Rocky Mountains and the Arkansas River. Smack dab in the middle of nowhere. Pueblo was called the Pittsburgh of the West because the main industry was the steel mill. But Colorado people called it the armpit of the West because the mill reeked of this metallic, rotten egg smell. This is where I grew up. And this is what I practiced. This is supposed to be the Bach Minuet in G. Our poor old piano was so beat up and beyond repair. So my folks splurged and ordered a new piano from back east. What we called any place east of the Mississippi River back east. When the new piano arrived, I played my Bach on it. Oh, so much better. Now, my cigarette-smoking piano teacher taught me how to count while I played. 1 and 2 and 3 and 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 she taught me finger numbers. 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 1, 3, 1, 2, 3. doing this. Oh, in fact, we're going to have an experiment. Okay. I want everyone to stand up. Everyone, even all you people live streaming, stand up, all right, in your homes, all right? And we're all going to pat our heads and rub our stomachs at the same time. All right, pretty easy, right? Now, I want you to switch hands and pat your head with the other hand and rub your stomach. It's really hard, right? Isn't it? Right? Anyway, thank you for indulging. And that's what it's like to play the piano and to push the pellets down at the same time. But one of the great things was, I forgot to tell you about my books. Oh my goodness. My John Thompson books, Modern Course for Piano, published in 1937, promised something new in every lesson. But it was really a series of cute little classical music tunes that didn't have any pedagogical order. You'd learn one skill in one tune, and then you would never hear about that skill again. But the good things about these books was that they all had pictures and descriptions of all of the music. So while I played my pieces, I would look at the picture, and I would read the description, and I would make up stories. Hello, I'm J.S. Bach, and I'm playing my famous minuet in G, surrounded by my 21 children. That was a lot better than 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and... But what I never learned was technique. And by technique, I mean scales. And arpeggios. And the dreaded Hanon exercises. These are designed to teach our fingers patterns and to make them stronger. But because I didn't have any technique, I just struggled with my little itty-bitty fingers trying to push down the heavy, gigantic piano keys. I never played any recitals, and I never had to memorize my music, so I always had to have the music in front of me. But the good news about having the music in front of me was that I could play anything you put down in front of me. And if it got too hard, I would just make stuff up. And I love musical theater, like Oklahoma, The Sound of Music, Jesus Christ Superstar. And I've had so many men before, in very many ways. He's just one more. I was 12. I'd hate it when we go visit my parents' friends, and my mom would turn to me and say, Cynthia, why don't you play something for us? And I'd be like, no, I don't have my music with me, and I don't have anything memorized because my brain isn't big enough to hold all of the notes. I actually thought that. But music was my shining star. I was special because I was a musician. I played the piano. Not everyone played the piano, but I did. And yet, I always thought I wasn't good enough and no one wanted to listen to me. You see, my family was divided into 2 groups. My mom, my sister Jessie, who played the flute, and me in one group, and my dad in another, by himself. Daddy was this distant god, quiet, smart, creative, always designing and building things. He was calm and logical and wasn't emotional like my mom. I wanted to be exactly like him. Daddy played the trombone, and he loved playing jazz and big band music. So even though he had a 9-to-5 job in a TV station, on evenings and weekends he was off playing jazz in bars and restaurants and leaving my mom home alone by herself, which she didn't like very much. So while Jessie and I played our classical music and our flute and piano duets together, my dad was off doing his own thing. It was only when I became an adult that I realized that musical families play together all the time, like the whole family. The Von Trapp family did, the Carter family, even the Partridge family on TV, but not us. My dad only played with this Leon Dudley. And as a kid, I thought, well, Daddy doesn't play with me because I'm not blind. You know, kid thinking. Even when I was in high school, Daddy would play gigs with guys from my high school class. I mean, I remember their names. George Roach and Bobby Montoya. It was always George Roach and Bobby Montoya. These were guys from my class that my dad was playing jobs with. And he would come home and he would wax poetic about them. I was jealous. I wanted him to play with me. But jazz was Daddy's world. It was like this secret club that I wasn't allowed to join. Daddy was this cool jazz musician, and he didn't really think very much of classical musicians. He called them squares. So I guess that made me a square classical musician. But my mom loved classical music. She went to the Pueblo Symphony with my Grandpa Shaw, and she had always wanted to take piano lessons when she was a little girl. So she was the one who took us to our lessons and made sure we practiced a half an hour every week. But my mom was a music lover, and not a music maker like my mysterious dad. So her support didn't mean as much to me. Plus, she resented my father's music making and his lack of involvement in our family life. I mean, she so desperately wanted him to be in our world, and he wasn't. And it was all music's fault. And even when we were together, we weren't. Right. This one time, my mom convinced my dad to take us all to the Great Sand Dunes National Park. So while she and my mom and Jessie and I climbed the dunes, laughing and joking and our feet sinking into the sand, my dad was in the parking lot, standing outside the car in his good shoes, smoking a cigarette and tapping his foot, waiting for us to finish. I mean, I do have sweet daddy memories. Like the time at the dinner table that he taught me how to do a 2 against 3 rhythm so that I could play the Debussy arabesque. In fact, I'm going to teach you all how to do it. All right, people at home, you too. All right, so first, you do a 2 rhythm with one hand. Here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2. That's very good. And now with the other hand, you do a 3 rhythm against that. Here we go. Better than you think, right? Anyway, that was very, very good. So now, when you all go home tonight, you too will be able to play the Debussy arabesque. On Sunday nights, he made popcorn for us for dinner, which we ate while we watched Bonanza. And this is how separate my dad was. He would make one bowl of popcorn, a big bowl of popcorn for himself, and drink Dr. Pepper. And he would make another big bowl of popcorn for my mom, Jessie, and me, and we would drink Pepsi. Totally separate. He also loved to make artichokes in the summertime. Popcorn and artichokes were his specialty. But when it came to making music together, Daddy and I didn't connect. I mean, would we have if I played jazz? I don't know, because he never offered to teach me. And I was so in awe of him, I didn't even ask. Jazz was Daddy's world. But it was sort of okay, because I was young, and I was busy with school and my friends, and I made classical music any way I could. All right, so this one time, I auditioned for the role of Golda in my high school production of Fiddler on the Roof. Hello, I'm Cynthia Shaw, and I'd like to sing the role of Golda. Do you love me? Well, they couldn't hear me, of course. But I was determined. So after everybody had finished auditioning, I said, "Hello, I'm Cynthia Shaw, and I'd like to sing again. Do you love me?" And they did, and I got the part. I also sang in choir, and sometimes before concerts, a couple of us altos would go in the parking lot and smoke joints. And then we'd go on stage and we'd look at each other in that knowing marijuana way. I mean, our director, Mr. Butcher, had told us to get high on life. I was just getting high on life and music. At nighttime, I would hear my parents arguing. My mom shouts, my dad silence. It got so bad that my mom ran off to the mountains for a purse full of sleeping pills. My dad was frantic. He drove to the mountains to look for my mom. Jessie and I were terrified. How was Daddy going to find Mommy in the gigantic Rocky Mountains? What if she never came back? Fortunately, she did. This is Whispering Hope. It's an old Victorian song that my grandmother Mimi, my dad's mom, taught to Jessie and me when we were kids. Mimi had been a silent movie pianist in Oklahoma. She was a pianist just like me, but she had made a bad marriage to my Grandpa Shaw. Now, you would think that Grandpa would bought her a beautiful piano to practice on, but he bought her an old player piano. It sat in the living room for years. We kids used to love to fool around on it. We'd pump the pedals with our feet and watch the keys magically go up and down by themselves while the roll inside just rolled and rolled. But it was a gimmick, and not really a good piano to actually play. He ultimately bought Mimi an electronic organ when she was old, and her fingers were riddled with arthritis. They had a sad marriage. Mimi would oftentimes disappear into her separate bedroom for days on end with headaches. She ultimately checked out with nervous breakdowns and pills that Grandpa had prescribed for her to help her get over her depression. Running away. Everyone was always running away, wishing they were someplace else. I guess that was easier than saying what it was that you wanted or trying to express yourself. We didn't do that. So I closed up. My mom told me I was a cold fish. But I felt like a beautiful box on the outside and empty on the inside. I mean, not that I thought I was physically beautiful, because trust me, I did not think that at all. I just felt fake on the outside and not good enough on the inside. I was determined to leave Pueblo and got into college at the University of Denver as a piano major. My new teacher was Francisco Ibar, and I adored him. He was from New York. Every lesson with him was a musical inspiration. I felt alive when I was in his presence, because with him, everything was about music and New York City. Oh, Cynthia, last week I was at Padelson's in New York, and I ran into the very famous pianist Rudolph Serpin, and he and I were discussing your Chopin Ballade. My Ballade? With Rudolph Serpin? At Padelson's? Wait, what's Padelson's? Oh, Padelson's is just the most important music store in New York. It's right listing all of the major and minor scales and arpeggios you'll need to be able to play to graduate. I had never seen that before, and I didn't know my scales and arpeggios, but I could play Brahms. I won the annual concerto competition. It was in college that I really started having major negative doubts that I was good enough. My world was getting bigger, and so were my insecurities. I loved playing the piano, but I seriously doubted that anyone really wanted to listen to me. And when I played, I would have these yapping demons in my head, yapping away, telling me how horrible I was, what a terrible pianist I was. Sometimes when I would play, I would even have anxiety attacks. This one time, I was on stage by myself in front of the entire music school. I was playing the Ravel, a fugue from the Ravel Tombeau de Confront, from memory. Now, it starts out simple enough, and then it wraps around itself. Myself in front of the entire music school. I hated that everyone was watching me. I hated being up there on stage. And I sabotaged myself all the time. But for some reason, Mr. Ibar kept encouraging me. So I spent hours and hours in the practice room. I knew I could play beautifully, and I knew I could play wonderfully, but just not all the time. I was a musician, just like my grandmother Mimi, and just like my dad. Mr. Ibar suggested that I audition for graduate school at his alma mater, the Manhattan School of Music in New York City, and that I should study with his teacher, Doris Zaslavsky. I was honored. I mean, he hadn't mentioned this to any of his other students. I'd never been to New York, but for some reason, I knew that's where I belonged. I mean, it was my dream to live in New York, the home of the New Yorker magazine. Once a month, my college roommate, Sally, and I would lie on her queen-size bed on our stomachs and watch live at the Met, the Metropolitan Opera live broadcast from New York City. Picture it. It's opening night at the Met. The men are in tuxedos. The women in fancy ball gowns. And they swoosh to their orchestra seats, their diamond tiaras gleaming in the light. The overture begins, and the crystal chandeliers magically recede into the ceiling. The red velvet curtains begin to open, and the orchestra rises to a climax. I had to go to New York, and I could hardly wait for my audition. Now, going to New York for my audition was huge. In fact, it was so huge that I skipped my college graduation to go. My sister Jessie came with me, and when we arrived, I quickly realized that New York was very different than Pueblo. For one thing, everyone in New York walks. In Pueblo, if people see you walking down the street, they think your car is broken and they offer to give you a ride. People in Pueblo pop in on each other, but people in New York don't even know who their neighbors are. Everyone in Pueblo wore bright colored clothing, but people in New York, they dressed in black, like there was a citywide funeral going on. Men in business suits walked down the street, licking ice cream cones. This was a whole different world, and I loved it. Now, the first night there, Jesse and I went to see a Broadway show. All right, on the count of 3, tell me what that show was. 1, 2, 3. Annie! Very good, excellent. Yes, it was Annie. So even though our hotel was like 5 blocks from the theater, Jesse and I were scared to walk down the street alone at nighttime, so we took the bus. And we sat in the seats next to the driver. It felt safer there. But those seats are reserved for the elderly and handicapped. We didn't know. Suddenly, 2 old ladies, as we called them, got on, and they saw that the elderly seats were taken. They sat nearby and they glared at us. And then one of them yelled, "You girls should be walking." I had never met old ladies like that before in my life. In Colorado, old people are kindly, warm, sweet grandparent types. They bake you cookies and tell you ancient stories. Not in New York. Those women kind of scared me, but they were kind of awesome too. Now, the next day was my audition at the Manhattan School of Music. Mr. Ibar had arranged for me to practice the piano that morning in his mother-in-law's penthouse apartment. A penthouse apartment. The maid let us in. There was a maid. I mean, nobody in Pueblo has a maid. And what do I see on the coffee table but the New Yorker? Well, of course she has a New Yorker. She lives in New York. Now, I hadn't touched the piano for a couple of days, which suddenly felt like a lifetime ago. And I got really nervous. I mean, today was my audition for the Manhattan School of Music, the most important music school in the world and where I wanted to be. What if I messed up? What if they didn't like me? No, I wasn't going to mess up, and they were going to like me because I practiced, and I was playing Beethoven. Jesse and I walked to the audition. I had never walked that far in my life. It took us over an hour, and I was almost late to the audition. By the time I walked in, I was so frazzled and exhausted, and what do I see at this long table but all these sourpuss, wrinkly-faced piano teachers? Kind of looked like that painting of the Last Supper. Hello, I'm Cynthia Shaw. I'm from Pueblo, Colorado, and I'll be playing Beethoven. to New York. Now, the year was 1977. New York was broke. I mean, New York had no money. Every night back in Pueblo on the news, my family and I would sit together and watch about all the horrible things happening in New York. Sex shops overran the Times Square theater district. The subways were covered with graffiti. And they said when you walk down the street, it smelled like urine. The serial killer, the son of Sam, he targeted young women with long black wavy hair. I had long black wavy hair. And then on July 17th, the whole city went into a total blackout. Thousands of New Yorkers took to the streets, rioting and looting. I mean, Pueblo was in the West, but New York was turning into the wild, wild West. As I sat there watching the news with my family in Pueblo, I just knew my parents would never let me go there. But amazingly, they did! And I went. The first thing I did was I had to find a place to live. The Manhattan School of Music had recommended the Parkside Evangeline Salvation Army Home. Gramercy Park. I moved in. They had practice rooms with pianos in the basement, right next to the boiling hot furnace. The first time I practiced there, I thought I was going to pass out from heat exhaustion. It was horrible. Thank goodness there was a beautiful piano on the second floor lounge. I could practice there. I played really loudly. Now, unfortunately, the second floor lounge piano was right over the major's office. The major was the Parkside Evangeline director who ran Parkside Evangeline. He ruled with a white glove and an iron fist. He told me my piano playing was driving him crazy, and I had two options. I could either practice in the hot as hell, boiling hot basement, well, those are my words, not his, or move out. Well, I had seen a woman in the dining hall stick her fingers in the butter dish and smear butter all over her face. I moved out. I kept looking. A billboard ad led me to a room for rent in a swinger's apartment. Well, I didn't really know how to play swing piano, so I wasn't really into swingers. So I decided to live on the Upper West Side, where all of the classical musicians lived. I rented a small studio apartment, probably not any bigger than this space right here, but it was within walking distance of Carnegie Hall. The apartment had beautiful inlaid wood floors and a gigantic bathroom. The advantage of the gigantic bathroom was that I could wash my dishes in the gigantic bathtub because there was no sink in the kitchen. The apartment had two windows. One faced a brick wall, like this. It was about 2 foot away from the window. The other one, on the fire escape, was locked with a security gate for which there was no key. I mean, heaven forbid there be a fire, I would be burned to a crisp. In Pueblo, we always had fire drills. The Irish landlady, Mrs. O'Neill, stopped by to welcome me to the building, and she asked me when my furniture was arriving. I told her I didn't have any furniture. So she took me down to the basement that was like a huge used furniture store. There was all this furniture left behind by former tenants. She said I could borrow whatever I wanted just as long as I returned everything when I moved out. Now I had to buy a piano. Back in Pueblo, Grandpa Shaw had always promised he would buy me a piano. He wouldn't buy my grandmother Mimi a piano, but he would buy me a piano. But there was a caveat. I had to get married and settle down first. But I wasn't getting married. to torture your family, your pets, and your neighbors, anyone within earshot. First, you play your right hand. Over and over. Until you get it right. Then you play your left hand. Again, over and over. Then you put it together. This can go on for hours and hours. Are you tortured yet? You are? Then I'm taking this as a yes. More. No. Anyway, my neighbors were. I had this one neighbor, Jim, who lived next door. He wrote sappy romance novels. Now, the wall between our apartments was paper thin. He wanted me to stop playing, but he was kind of shy, and he didn't want to tell me directly, so he would write notes and put them under my door. One of them said, "I'm writing a love scene, and I can't get into the mood with all this loud piano playing going on." Every other pianist I knew lived in an apartment that had thick walls, and they could practice whenever they wanted. And Jim's note just reminded me of all of the people who didn't want to hear me play the piano. My mom, who would vacuum while I played, our cat Ginger, who would bite me, and then my dad. So I moved the piano across the beautiful inlaid wood floors, stuffed a blanket in the back, and continued practicing. Now, in popular media, pianos are moving all the time. In the cartoons, the coyote pushes the piano off the cliff to try to hit the little roadrunner below. Or in the old movies, they would hoist a piano up the outside of a building, a big grand piano on a little itty-bitty pulley. And then when it got to the top, for some unknown reason, it would break free and crash down onto the ground in a million pieces. Even in Laurel and Hardy, they pushed an upright piano up a block-long flight of stairs, only to have it slide back down over and over again. And, little-known fact, in the Second World War, Steinway pianos were airlifted into battlefields so that the soldiers could entertain themselves when they weren't fighting. Did you know that? No. Right? Is that cool? It's amazing what a little research does. They even actually put pianos in submarines. Music and everything. So pianos are just moving all over the place. So I guess my piano was no different. Another note appeared under the door. It said carpet. So I bought a carpet. So now I have to move my big old upright grand piano onto the carpet. I tried pushing the piano, but the piano's too heavy and the carpet is too thick. So I get this bright idea to lift the piano. And look, the piano tipped over on its back. And there it lay like a beached whale on top of the carpeting in the middle of my small studio apartment. Suddenly another note appeared under the door. It said, "I have an idea." And then Jim is madly knocking on my door. Jim has come up with a red light, green light system. If he puts a green sticker on his door, it means I can practice. And if he puts a red sticker on his door, it means I can't practice. What? And then he sees the piano on the floor. And he takes pity on me. And together, Jim and I lift up the piano and move it into place. Suddenly, Jim and I are new best friends. And this was just in time because I had a piano lesson with my teacher, Dora Zaslowski, Mr. Ibar's former New York piano teacher. Dora had been teaching at Manhattan School of Music since the 1920s. She was old and short and plump, with a white streak in her otherwise badly dyed black hair. She kind of looked like a skunk. She wore these long, flowing, loose-fitting dresses that covered up her ample bosoms. She was cultured and sophisticated, but also arrogant and condescending. I played my Bach cue for her. No, Cynthia, you have to play with more passion, more drama. Here, let the expert do it. You have to make love to the piano. Cynthia, you are not practicing enough. I practice all the time. Well, as long as there was a green sticker on Jim's door. But I never seemed to be home when Dora would call me to check up on me. She did this to all of her students, making sure they were practicing. She also had these Wednesday night piano soirees in her huge Central Park West apartment overlooking Central Park. It was weird. First, we'd have dinner and Dora would royally preside at one end, and her husband, John, who had been a famous painter, would be at the other end. He had suffered a series of strokes, and he drooled while he was being fed by his nurse. After dinner, we would all play for each other. Now, all of the other pianists, all of them were so amazing and so good, and they all played like this. But because I would get so nervous and intimidated by everyone, I played like this. It was just awful. But I did meet a fellow pianist there, Joyce. Joyce was from Texas, and she had red curly hair and spoke with a twang. She and I became instant friends. Now, Joyce was already studying in Manhattan School of Music with Dora, and so she knew all of the gossip. She said, Cynthia, don't take Dora so seriously. She's just trying to intimidate everyone. At school, they call her the Queen. But one of the really great things about meeting all of these other pianists at Dora's is that we would all go to Carnegie Hall to hear famous pianists perform. We'd sit in the top of the balcony, the cheap seats, the nosebleed section. And after a while, I began to realize that all of the people sitting around me were classical piano students. Some even brought their musical scores to follow along. It was so exciting. We'd be there on the edge of our seats. There'd be burly Russian pianist Lazar Berman playing Liszt. Or petite Spanish pianist Alicia de la Rocha playing Mozart. It was rumored that her hands were so small she could barely reach an octave. Or dreamy Italian pianist Maurizio Pollini playing Schubert. He was so sexy. But the highlight of it all was hearing Vladimir Horowitz play his rousing transcription of John Philip Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever. I loved going to Carnegie Hall, and then sometimes I go across the street and hear some jazz. There was this jazz pianist, Dick Hyman. That was really his name, Dick Hyman. He was playing Dave Brubeck's piece, Take 5. I had never heard jazz piano like that before in my life. I mean, back in Pueblo, my dad played with Leon Dudley, but it was nothing like this. asking myself, why do I need to go to graduate school at the Manhattan School of Music? Am I trying to prove something to my dad who never graduated from college? Am I doing it because I think I will meet people who will help further my career? I was so innocent, I didn't even know that that was something that people did. But what I did know was I did not want to go back to Pueblo, and playing the piano was my ticket out. Finally, at the beginning of December, I had my second Manhattan School audition. I don't even know what I played, it's all just a big blur. And then Dora called me. Cynthia, you did not get into the Manhattan School of Music the second time. You have embarrassed me in front of all of the other piano teachers. I no longer want you as a student. You are not a good enough pianist to live in New York. To get a little sympathy, I called home. But my mom wasn't there, so I spoke to my dad. And even before I could tell him about Dora and the audition, he started rattling on about all of the music jobs he had. Was he trying to connect with me or impress me? Finally, when I could get a word in edgewise, he just said, well, honey, I'm sure you'll figure it out. He didn't want to hear I was having a hard time being a musician in New York, that I was struggling, that I needed help and guidance. I needed him. So I called Joyce. She said, Cynthia, why don't you just call the president of Manhattan School and ask him to recommend another teacher? He recommended Solomon Makowski, but I decided to wait to call him because I was going home to visit my family for Christmas. Once I got back home to Pueblo, my mom said, Cynthia, New York is not the place for you. You need to move back home. I didn't know what to do, so I flew back to New York to return the old upright grand piano, return the old furniture to Mrs. O'Neill, and leave for good. I walked into my small studio apartment, locked the door, and just stood there in the dark, looking around. And then it hit me. This is my apartment. This is where I live. No one can come in here unless I invite them. I'm not going home. I am home. I immediately called my mom. But Cynthia, we decided. No, Mommy, you decided. I'm staying in New York. I called Mr. Makowski to set up a lesson, and he asked me if I knew my scales and arpeggios. Of course I didn't know my scales and arpeggios. I had been avoiding them my entire life. He said, you need them. He wasn't flamboyant like Mr. Ibar or dramatic like Dora. He was all nuts and bolts, black and white, straightforward. He cared about me, and he knew what I needed to do to get into Manhattan School of Music. He was a musical father I never had. Finally, I had my third audition for Manhattan School of Music. This time, I was really prepared. Hello, I'm Cynthia Shaw, and I'll be playing Brahms. much better than me. I did get my master's degree in piano performance from the Manhattan School of Music. When I did my graduation recital, my mom and my dad and my sister came. My mom was thrilled. My dad was quiet. I don't know if he was proud of me or not, but what I do know is that even though he lived for another 35 years, that was the last time he ever heard me play the piano. So, here we are, many years later. I still live in New York. I still play classical piano. I performed at Carnegie Hall, not as a pianist, but as a singer, singing backup vocals for groups. I even got one time to sing with Sir Paul McCartney. I met him and I got his autograph, so that was awfully fun. I keep thinking that I'm going to learn how to play jazz piano someday. And because of my love of storytelling, I've become an actress in film and theater. And I teach piano lessons. I try to share my love of music with my piano students, and I make sure they practice their scales and arpeggios every day. But we work on things like fingering and making the melodies really beautiful, or fast passage work. And then sometimes, while they're playing, we pretend that elephants are dancing, or fairies are flying up into the air, or that the piano is an orchestra, and the cellos are running up the tree like little squirrels being chased by barking dogs. Anything to get them out of their heads and diminish the yapping demons going on in their heads, telling them that they're not good enough. Because you know what? They are. I'm Cynthia Shaw, and I'll be playing the Debussy L'Île Joyeuse, the Joyous Isle, just like New York City.